The wedding dress was perfect. The flowers were perfect. 200 guests were seated and waiting, and she was standing at the top of the stairs with 42 minutes left. 42 minutes before she was supposed to say the two most important words of her life. But she had just heard something through a wall, a voice she knew better than her own heartbeat, her billionaire fiancé's voice, calm, controlled, certain. She doesn't know. She will never know. And by the time she figures it out, it won't matter. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She stood very still and she listened. And in the next 4 minutes, she learned everything. The other woman, the secret transfer of her company, the legal clause buried in paragraph 9 of a document she had signed at the kitchen table while eating an apple on a Tuesday afternoon. He had taken everything she built, and he was standing at the altar right now, completely confident, waiting for her to walk down and hand him the rest. He thought he had won. He had no idea what was coming. What you are about to hear is a story about the moment a woman stopped explaining away what she knew and chose herself instead. This story is for anyone who has ever trusted the wrong person, for anyone who has ever made themselves smaller to fit inside someone else's plan, for anyone who has ever sat in a parked car, unable to go inside, knowing something was wrong, but not yet knowing what to do with that knowing. This story is yours. If this sounds like something you need today, stay with us. And if this story moves you, if it reaches something real inside you, please share it with one person who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below. Tell us what you felt. Like this video so more people can find it. Subscribe to the channel because every week we bring you stories exactly like this one. Stories about real women, real choices, and what it looks like to find your way back to yourself. Now, let's begin.
The sound came through the wall. Low, controlled, familiar. She doesn't know, she will never know, and by the time she figures it out, it won't matter. Caroline Whitfield stood very still. She was in the bridal suite of the Alderton Grand Hotel. Second floor, corner room, the kind of room that costs more per night than most people spend on rent. White roses everywhere, the scent of eucalyptus, and something warm, candles, maybe, or the heated marble floors. A champagne flute sat on the vanity, still half full. She hadn't touched it in 20 minutes. She was alone. Petra had gone downstairs to have the bouquet refreshed. Something about the peonies, wilting on one side. Diane, her mother, had stepped out to find a safety pin for her dress. The seamstress on the third floor, someone had told her, very good with safety pins. 6 minutes, maybe 7. The only stretch of the entire morning when no one was in the room with her. And then she heard the voice, Grant's voice. She knew it the way you know a voice you've fallen asleep to for 4 years. The particular weight of it, the way it never fully relaxed. Even now, wherever he was, whatever room was below her, it was controlled, precise. The voice of a man who had never in his life said something he didn't intend. The prenuptial agreement is airtight. Sylvia made sure of that. Even if she contests it in 5 years, she gets nothing above the settlement floor. The heating vent was in the corner of the room, small, brass-framed. She had noticed it when they first showed her the suite 3 weeks ago and thought nothing of it. Old buildings carried sound in unexpected ways. She had assumed any noise was just the hotel. She pressed herself against the wall beside it. She did not breathe. And the design firm? A second voice. Older, dry as old paper. Warren Alderton, Grant's father, 79 years old and sharp as a blade. The man who shook her hand at their first meeting and looked at her the way a person looks at a piece of furniture they're considering purchasing. She had told herself it was just his manner. Old money intimidation, the way men of a certain generation made women feel small without even trying. She had explained it away. She was excellent at explaining things away. Transferred, Grant said, quietly, 3 months ago. She doesn't know. She doesn't know. The room was very cold suddenly. The dress weighed 400 pounds, ivory silk charmeuse with a cathedral train and 32 hand-sewn buttons up the back. Petra had done them up one at a time this morning, counting out loud. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 32. Caroline looked at the clock on the mantel. 10:43. The ceremony started at 11:30, 47 minutes. In the crane situation? Warren asked. A pause. Just half a second. The kind of pause that means something. Resolved, Grant said. Sylvia understands what this marriage is, what it isn't. Sylvia, Crane. Grant's attorney. The woman who had drafted the prenuptial agreement. The woman Caroline had met exactly twice. Once at a dinner, once at a signing. Precise, elegant, the kind of woman who made you feel slightly underdressed without doing anything at all. Caroline had assumed a professional dynamic. Clean and simple, she had assumed a great many things. She pressed her palm flat against the wall. She listened. The next 4 minutes taught her everything. Grant and Sylvia had been in a relationship for 2 years, not an affair. That word implied something stolen and furtive. A relationship, the kind built on genuine understanding and genuine choice. Sylvia was the person Grant went to when he wanted to be himself, not the version of himself he maintained for Caroline, not the version he showed the board, not the version he performed for the press and the charity galas and the symposiums. Caroline was the marriage. Sylvia was the life. The design firm, Whitfield Studio, her firm, the thing she had built from nothing, from a drafting table she bought at an estate sale when she was 26, from 2 clients who believed in her before she had a track record, from 12 years of work and stubbornness and 16-hour days and cold food and absolute certainty that she was making something real. Transferred to a holding company controlled by the Alderton Family Trust, 3 months ago. Through a clause in an agreement she had signed at the kitchen table of their shared apartment on a Tuesday afternoon while eating an apple. She remembered the apple. She remembered Grant sliding the document across the table and saying, "It's just standard language, Caroline. It protects both of us. You don't need a separate attorney for this. It's really very simple." She remembered thinking he was being thoughtful, managing the details so she didn't have to. That was Grant. He managed everything. He managed everything. Then Warren mentioned a name, Thomas Beckett, her former business partner. The person she had walked away from 4 years ago when Grant said, gently, reasonably, with that particular careful tone he used when he was telling her what to do while making it sound like he was simply thinking out loud, that Thomas was not the right influence for someone trying to build a serious future, that Thomas's approach to the business was holding her back, that she had outgrown that chapter. She had let Thomas go, quietly, without a real explanation. She told herself it was the mature thing, the adult thing, the right thing. She had not spoken to him in 4 years. "Beckett is here," Warren said. "He came to the ceremony." A long silence. "It doesn't matter," Grant said. "By tonight, it's done." Caroline stood up straight. She walked to the window. Below her, through gauze curtains, she could see the garden. White chairs in neat rows, enormous arrangements of roses and eucalyptus, a string quartet near the gazebo, playing something soft that she couldn't quite hear. Waitstaff moving between the cocktail station and the side entrance, guests arriving, women in colorful dresses, men adjusting their ties, 200 people. Her reflection hovered in the glass in front of her. She was wearing her grandmother's combs, small gold pieces set with seed pearls. She had always imagined wearing them on her wedding day, since she was a girl. She had told Grant about them once, early on. He nodded and said they sounded lovely. He never mentioned them again. She looked at herself in the glass. She looked like a bride. She looked nothing like herself. The clock read 10:47, 42 minutes. She picked up her phone, locked it, unlocked it, locked it again, put it face down on the bed, picked it up, opened a text to Petra, stared at the blank message box, deleted the draft, closed the app, set the phone on the vanity. Picked it up again, put it in her bouquet for 4 seconds before she realized how senseless that was. She set it back down. Her hands were shaking. Not crying, shaking. There is a difference. The body understands things before the mind catches up. She had been in that state before. Not this exact moment, not this exact room, but that precise place where something has shifted and the rest of you is simply waiting to find out what. She sat back down on the edge of the bed, her hands in her lap, her eyes completely dry. The clock ticked, ticked, ticked. I know what I heard, she thought, not as a question, as a fact, plain and solid as the floor beneath her feet. I know exactly what I heard. 42 minutes. She sat with it. The door opened. Petra came in with the bouquet, white peonies and garden roses, and trailing greenery, freshly adjusted, perfect. She stopped in the doorway. She looked at Caroline's face. Her expression changed. 17 years of friendship. You learn a person's face like a language, every shift and shadow. Petra set the bouquet on the vanity table. What happened? She said. Close the door, Caroline said. Petra closed the door. She didn't ask again. She just waited. Caroline told her. Not everything. Not yet. The most immediate facts. The vent. Grant's voice. Warren's voice. Sylvia's name, the firm. Petra was quiet for a very long time. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, a door opened and closed. Somewhere down the hall, a woman laughed. Heels on marble. Regular morning sounds. The world continuing as if nothing had shifted on its axis. Then Petra said it. Honey, I've been biting my tongue for 2 years. She sat beside Caroline on the bed, not hugging her. She knew better. The hug would break the careful architecture Caroline was building inside herself right now, so she just sat and she talked. She talked about the dinner party, 18 months ago. Grant's colleague's house in the hills, 8 people around a long table. Caroline had mentioned the sourcing of a particular reclaimed timber. She had been using it for a decade. She knew its properties the way a surgeon knows instruments. And Grant had corrected her. Not once, 3 times. Each correction delivered with that pleasant, measured tone, as if he were simply clarifying, as if he were helping. Everyone laughed at his third correction. It was slightly funny, the way he phrased it. Caroline had laughed too. Petra had watched her laugh and felt something go wrong in her chest. I watched you laugh, Petra said, and I thought, she knows this isn't funny. She's just doing what she does. She's managing it. She talked about the vacation, the Amalfi Coast. Grant had rebooked Caroline's return flight without asking. She was supposed to stay an extra 2 days with a client contact who had been trying to connect with her for months. Grant changed the flight because his schedule shifted, and he thought it made more sense for them to return together. He told her about it at dinner. He presented it as thoughtfulness, efficient thoughtfulness. He had managed the detail. Caroline had thanked him. She had thanked him for canceling her meeting without asking. And the night my dad went to the hospital, Petra said. Her voice was steady but very quiet. I called you at midnight, Grant answered. He told me you were asleep. He told me not to wake you. He gave you the message in the morning. Carolyn looked at her. I didn't know, she said. I know you didn't. He never told me you called that night. I know. A silence between them. The weight of it was enormous. I thought you knew all of it, Petra said. I thought you were choosing it anyway. Like you had made some calculation I didn't understand, and I didn't know how to say, I don't think you're choosing this. I think you just stopped seeing yourself. Caroline looked down at her hands. The engagement ring, 3 carats. Platinum band? He had proposed at a restaurant she had mentioned once in passing, 2 years before they got engaged. She had been talking about a meal she'd had there years ago, an offhand comment at the end of a different conversation. She was overwhelmed when he took her there, the precision of the memory, the fact that he had listened to something so small. She thought it was love. God, she thought, I was so stupid. The signs were all there, not as a question, as a fact, cold and clear. The signs were all there. He never forgot anything she said because he was building a file, not a relationship. Every time she felt seen, she was being assessed. She wasn't his partner. She was his acquisition. The firm, she said. Tell me what you know about the transfer. Petra shook her head. I didn't know about the transfer. I didn't know the specifics. But you knew something. I knew that the agreement you signed last year wasn't standard. I looked up the holding company name once. I saw it on a document on his desk when I picked you up from his office. I Googled it. It came back to the Alderton Trust. She paused. I told myself I was wrong, that I was being paranoid, that you would have known if something was wrong. I wouldn't have known, Caroline said. I trusted him. The word sat between them. Trusted. Past tense. The door opened. Diane came in, safety pin in hand. She stopped immediately. She looked at her daughter. She looked at Petra. She was 64 years old, and she had been divorced twice and rebuilt herself twice. And she had the particular gift of women who have survived difficult things, the ability to walk into a room and understand the emotional temperature within seconds. What do you need? She asked. Not what happened. Not are you all right. Just, what do you need? Thomas Beckett is here, Caroline said. Petra? You mentioned seeing him in the garden? About 20 minutes ago. 6th row, left side. Grant didn't invite him, Caroline said. I didn't invite him. Someone else did. They looked at each other. Nora, Diane said. Nora. Grant's personal assistant, 11 years. The woman who sent birthday flowers in Grant's name and who called Caroline Miss Whitfield and who managed every detail of his life, including, it seemed, certain details of this morning. She knows everything, Caroline said. Yes, Petra agreed. She always has. Caroline stood up. She walked to the center of the room. She thought about the next 40 minutes, about what she was holding, about what it meant, about what kind of woman she was going to be at 11:30 when she walked through those garden doors. She had a choice. She could make this small, private. She could excuse herself, get in a car, go somewhere quiet. Let the wedding simply not happen. Let Grant manage the fallout, because he would, because he was very good at that. Or, find Nora, she said. Petra was already reaching for her phone. I deserved better than this, Caroline thought. Not as a plea, not as a wound, as a statement of simple fact. From the very first day, I deserved better than this. The knock on the door was quiet. 3 soft taps. Petra opened it. Nora stood in the hallway in her usual dark blazer, tablet in hand, the expression she always wore. Composed, professional, revealing nothing. She looked past Petra to Caroline. And then something happened in Nora's face. Something loosened, like a person who has been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just been told they can finally set it down. She stepped inside. Petra closed the door behind her. The four women stood in the bridal suite, white roses, champagne. The cathedral train of Caroline's dress pooled on the marble floor. Outside, the string quartet had started a new piece, something light and unhurried. I was afraid you wouldn't hear it, Nora said. Caroline looked at her. You knew about the vent. I've worked in this hotel for 11 years. I know every room. I know which walls carry sound and which don't. You put him in that study this morning. He asked me to arrange a private room near the bridal suite, somewhere he and Mr. Warren could speak without being disturbed. I chose that room. And you made sure I was alone? I suggested to your friend that the bouquet needed refreshing. A pause. And I told your mother that the seamstress on the third floor was very good with safety pins. Diane made a sound, something between a breath and a laugh. Caroline looked at Nora for a long moment. This quiet, precise woman, 11 years. She had assumed loyalty to the man who paid her salary. The kind of professional devotion that doesn't bend. She had never thought to look at it differently. Why? She asked. Nora's hands were still on her tablet. Very still. She looked at the floor for just a moment, then back at Caroline. I watched him do this once before, she said. 11 years ago. Her name was Clara. She was kind. She was trusting. She didn't find out until after the wedding. He had a relationship with someone else while she was pregnant. She found out when the other woman's attorney called her. She paused. I stayed on because I told myself I was managing the damage, keeping things from getting worse. But that is what people tell themselves when they are complicit and they know it. The room was very quiet. You reminded me of her, Nora said. But you're not her. You are sharper. You build things. I thought if you knew, if you had enough time, you would use it differently than she did. She reached inside her blazer. She produced a folded document. She held it out. Carolyn took it. She unfolded it carefully. It was a copy of the agreement, the one she had signed at the kitchen table, on a Tuesday, with an apple in her hand. Paragraph 9 was highlighted in yellow. The clause was 17 lines long, dense, the kind of language that moved you past it quickly, the way legal text often did, not because it was meaningless, but because it was designed to feel like it was. The clause stated that the transfer of any business interest co-signed under the agreement would be valid only if the secondary party, Caroline, had not received independent legal counsel before signing. There was one line, buried in the middle. He knew you wouldn't get your own attorney, Nora said quietly. He presented it as a formality. He knew you would trust him. He bet on my trust, Carolyn said, not with anger, with clarity. Yes, Nora said. Caroline looked at the second document Nora was now holding out. A registration record. The transfer itself, dated 3 months ago, registered to the Alderton Family Trust. She looked at the date. 3 months ago, she and Grant had been in Napa for a weekend. She remembered it as one of their better weekends. They had walked through vineyards, and he had held her hand, and she had thought, this is what it's supposed to feel like. This is what I've been waiting for. That weekend, her life's work was being moved into his family's name. He never loved me, she thought. He loved the idea of me. He loved what I represented, the kind of woman who makes a man look cultured and successful and complete. There's something else, Nora said. She pulled out her phone, turned the screen toward Caroline. It was a name, a phone number, a brief message. Thomas Beckett had contacted Nora 6 weeks ago. He had a friend who worked at the business registration office. The friend had seen the transfer notice on Whitfield Studio and called Thomas immediately. Thomas had been trying to reach Caroline through channels Grant didn't monitor, because Grant monitored Caroline's phone and her email. He kept the original business registration documents, Nora said, from before you met Grant. The ones establishing Whitfield Studio as an independent legal entity, he's had them for 4 years. Caroline stood completely still. Why did he keep them? Nora looked at her. He said, in case you ever wanted them back. The room was silent. Petra was standing by the door, with her hand over her mouth. Diane was sitting very straight in the chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap. Her expression composed in the way that meant she was feeling something enormous and choosing not to show it yet. "Where is he?" Caroline said. "Sixth row, left side of the garden." Caroline handed the documents back to Nora. "Keep these." "I'll keep them," Nora said. "How much time do we have?" Petra checked her phone. 31 minutes. I'm not crazy, Caroline thought. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I know what I'm holding. She looked at herself in the mirror across the room. The woman in the mirror was 38 years old. She had built a firm from a drafting table and 2 clients and 12 years of absolute refusal to give up. She had survived 1,000 difficult mornings in that firm, budget crises, and difficult clients and projects that nearly broke her. She had never once run from the hard thing. She was not going to run from this one either. "Petra," she said, "I need 5 minutes with Thomas before the ceremony. I'll bring him to the East Corridor." "Good." She looked at her mother. "Don't let anyone come up here." Diane stood up, straightened her dress. "No one is coming up here," she said. The East Service Corridor smelled like clean linen and floor polish. A long hallway, fluorescent light, the kind of space guests never see. The working spine of the hotel, functional and plain, a door at the far end led to the service exit. She noticed it. She filed it away. Thomas Beckett was waiting near a linen cart. He looked exactly as she remembered, slightly rumpled in his good suit, which she recognized as his attempt at formal. Honest face, the kind of face that made you feel, immediately and without effort, that the person looking at you was telling you the truth. He saw her. He didn't say anything right away. He just looked at her, at the dress, at her face, at whatever her face was communicating that she hadn't entirely planned. "Caroline," he said. That was all. He waited. Thomas always waited. It was one of the things she had forgotten about him. He never filled silence with words just to fill it. She told him. All of it, quickly. The vent, Grant's voice, Warren's voice, Sylvia, the clause in paragraph 9, the transfer, Nora's document. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he pulled out his phone. He had the original Whitfield Studio registration documents, photographed, saved to 3 separate cloud accounts, and, he said this carefully, watching her face, sent to a physical attorney 2 months ago. "I wasn't sure what you'd want to do," he said. "I didn't know if you'd believe me. I didn't know if you were happy, if what you had was real. I didn't want to take that from you, if it was." She looked at him. It wasn't real. "I know." A pause. "I'm sorry." She considered that for a moment. "I'm not," she said. "I mean, I will be. There are things I'll grieve, but right now, standing here, in this corridor, I'm not sorry at all. Right now, I'm very clear." Thomas looked at her carefully. "What are you going to do?" She had been holding the answer to that question since minute 8 of standing at the heating vent. She had not said it out loud until now. Saying it out loud would make it real. Saying it out loud would mean she was committed to a version of the next hour that was going to change everything. She said it. "I'm going to walk down that aisle. I'm going to stand at that altar, and then I'm going to speak." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "You know he'll have attorneys working by this afternoon," he said. "I know. He'll manage the narrative. He'll try. The documents are solid, Caroline. The clause is legally fragile. Your attorney—" "I have an attorney," she said. "My own. Not one from his network. I called her 6 months ago." She paused. "I don't know why. Something in me just... I made the call." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "You knew," he said. "Somewhere, you knew." The hardest part, she thought, is admitting I knew all along, she said. The hardest part is admitting I knew all along. He nodded. He didn't say anything to soften it. He didn't say you couldn't have known or anyone would have been fooled. He just nodded. Because that is what it means to respect someone. You let them hold the complicated truth without trying to take it from them. The documents, she said. Can you have them accessible today? Already done. 6th row. Left side. Don't move. He looked at her. The expression on his face was something she would remember for a long time. Not pity, not worry, something cleaner than that. You look like yourself, he said. She turned and walked back down the corridor. 22 minutes. The corridor was quiet. The fluorescent light hummed. Her cathedral train brushed the floor. She was walking toward something. She could feel it the way you feel a storm. Not visible yet, but present in the air, in the pressure, in the way everything goes slightly still before it breaks. The door at the far end of the corridor was the service exit. She did not look at it. She kept walking. Petra was in the bridal suite doorway when Caroline came back. 12 minutes, Petra said. I need 8, Caroline said. She went into the en-suite bathroom. She sat on the edge of the tub. The bathroom was enormous, white marble, a clawfoot tub, and a separate glass shower. A vanity lit from all sides, the kind that shows you every detail. It smelled like the eucalyptus candles, and her own perfume, and the faint, clean scent of the marble. She did not cry yet. She sat on the cold porcelain edge in her cathedral train wedding dress, and she let the memories come. Because they were going to come regardless. They had been building since the vent. She might as well face them now. Here, alone, rather than have them arrive, in the middle of something she needed to be clear-headed for. The first memory came fast. Boston, the symposium. She was 34. She had been invited to present. A significant honor, the kind that doesn't come often, the kind she had worked toward for years. She stood at the podium and spoke about her work with the certainty of someone who has earned their knowledge through practice, not theory. Grant was in the audience. He approached her afterward. He had a question about load-bearing asymmetry in reclaimed structures. It was a good question, an intelligent question. She thought, this man has done his homework. She thought, this man is genuinely interested. He was interested. He was assessing. The second memory, 6 months in. A deadline she had held perfectly for 3 years. A project she had promised to a client she respected. Grant had planned a trip to Portugal that overlapped by 2 days. She mentioned the conflict once, gently. He said the trip was important. He said these opportunities didn't come twice. He said she needed to learn to balance her ambitions with her life. She missed the deadline. She told her client she was ill. She had never missed a deadline before. She had not missed one since. But she told herself she was growing. Grant said she was growing, and she wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe the missed deadline was evolution rather than erasure. The third memory, 14 months ago, she had started planning the expansion of Whitfield Studio into a second city. She had the numbers. She had a potential space. She had a partner interest from a colleague in Denver who had been circling the idea for 2 years. She brought it to Grant over dinner. He listened. He nodded. He said, let's talk about the right timing for that. They never talked about it again. Every time she raised it, there was a reason to wait. The market, his travel schedule, the board merger he was managing, her stress levels. He was concerned, he said, about her stress levels. He wanted to be protective of her energy. She had let the Denver colleague go. She had let the expansion go. She had let so many things go. I was being managed, she thought, the whole time, like a property, like something he had already purchased and was now simply maintaining. She sat in the silence of the marble bathroom. The clock on the wall read 11:14. 16 minutes. She looked at the ceiling. The chandelier above the tub was all crystal and warm light, and it cost more than her first car. She thought about who she was at 26. Studio apartment, water stains on the ceiling, drafting table from an estate sale, $60, slightly uneven on one leg. She fixed it with a folded matchbook. 2 clients, cold pad thai at 11 at night because she forgot to eat real meals. Sunday calls with her mother. The absolute bone-deep certainty that she was going to build something. She had been happy. Not performing happy, not explaining it away happy. Genuinely, uncomplicatedly, working hard and loving it happy. When did she stop being that person? Not all at once. She understood that now. It was never one moment. It was 1,000 small surrenders, each one reasonable in isolation, each one justified, each one taken freely by a woman who loved someone and wanted to believe she was choosing generosity rather than erosion, until she looked up and she was in someone else's story, playing a role in someone else's plan, in a dress she had approved but he had chosen, in a building he owned, about to make a vow to a man who had already quietly absorbed everything that was hers. She reached up. She touched her grandmother's combs, 2 small gold pieces set with seed pearls. Her grandmother wore them at her wedding in 1951. Her mother wore them at her second wedding. The good one, the one that lasted. Diane always said, "The second time I knew what I was choosing. The second time I chose right. These are mine," Caroline thought. These have always been mine. She was going to keep them. She stood up. She looked at herself in the vanity mirror, the lit kind that shows you everything. She had been crying without noticing. Not dramatic crying, just the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself. She took a cloth from the vanity, pressed it gently under her eyes. The makeup held, waterproof. She had requested waterproof everything. She had not known this morning why that felt important. She knew now. I'm not crazy, she thought. I know what I heard. I know what I'm about to do. She took a breath. She opened the bathroom door. Petra looked at her face. You cried, Petra said. I did, Caroline said. Good, Petra said. Now you're done. It was not quite true, but it was close enough. Diane was standing by the window with Caroline's bouquet. She held it out. Caroline took it. The peonies smelled clean and a little sweet. The roses were still perfect. The greenery trailed down over her hands. 9 minutes, Diane said. Tell me what you know about Nora's situation, Caroline said. After today, she'll be released by end of business, Petra said. Grant's not the forgiving type. I know. She thought for a moment. I have a building. I'm getting my building back. If she needs work. That's generous, Petra said. It's practical, Caroline said. She knows everything about how he operates, and she's clearly decided to stop protecting him. She walked to the full-length mirror. She looked at herself. And here, in this moment, something shifted. The grief from the bathtub was still there. It would be there for a long time. She was not naive about that. Grief doesn't leave just because you've made a decision. But underneath it now, something new was moving. Not anger exactly. Something more useful than anger. Clarity. Absolute clarity. The kind that arrives after everything confusing has been stripped away. He had taken her firm. He had taken her ambitions. He had taken 4 years of her work and her self-concept and her ability to trust her own instincts. He had done it methodically and patiently and with a great deal of charm. And he believed she could hear it in his voice, through the vent, in the complete confidence of his tone, that she would never know. That she would walk down that aisle in this dress and say those words and become, legally and permanently, Mrs. Alderton, and by the time the picture cleared, she would be in a position where leaving cost her everything she had built. He believed that about her. He had been wrong. She wasn't the same woman anymore, she thought. She wasn't the woman who signed things without reading paragraph 9. She wasn't the woman who laughed at dinner parties when she should have spoken. She wasn't the woman who thanked a man for canceling her meetings. She was the woman who built Whitfield Studio on $60 and a matchbook. She was the woman who had spent 12 years earning the right to stand at that symposium podium. She was the woman who, right now, in this room, was going to make a choice. "Petra," she said, "after I walk down the aisle, I need you in the garden. Front row, right side, my side. I need you to watch." "I'll be watching," Petra said. "Mom." Diane turned. "If Warren Alderton tries to stand up—" "He won't," Diane said simply. "He won't, because I'll be right behind him." Caroline looked at her mother, Diane Whitfield, 64 years old, twice divorced, and twice rebuilt. The woman who had driven her to her first client meeting in a car with no air conditioning and said, "You're better prepared than you think. You just have to show them." "I love you," Caroline said. "I love you too," Diane said. "Now let's go." Caroline picked up the cathedral train. She moved toward the door. The hallway outside smelled like fresh flowers and hotel carpet. Below, through the window at the corridor's end, she could see the garden. White chairs filling with guests, the string quartet, the altar with its arch of white roses, Father Brennan in his vestments, Grant at the end of the aisle. Grant at the end of the aisle, standing the way he always stood in public, chest out, measured ease, the performance of a man entirely at home in large rooms. She had admired that quality. It had felt like confidence. She understood now that it was something different. It was control. The door at the top of the stairs opened. The processional music began. Starting over feels impossible, she thought. But staying quiet feels worse. She walked to the top of the stairs. She put her hand on her mother's arm. "One foot in front of the other," Diane said softly. "That's all," Caroline agreed. They did not go down immediately. There was a moment at the top of the stairs when the processional music floated up from the garden and the white light of the late morning came through the window and everything was very still. Caroline asked Petra to give her 2 minutes. Petra looked at her. 2 minutes. 2 minutes, Caroline confirmed. Petra stepped aside. Diane stepped aside. And for the second time that morning, Caroline was alone. There was a small alcove at the top of the staircase, a window seat with a cushion. She sat on it, folded her hands in her lap, looked at the window. Below, the garden was almost full, 200 people finding their seats, programs being folded and unfolded. The particular hum of a crowd that doesn't know yet that what they came to witness is not what they're going to see. She thought about the back door, the service exit at the end of the east corridor. She had noticed it. She had filed it away. 30 seconds to reach it. 2 minutes to reach the street. She could be in a cab before the ceremony even started. She could be at her mother's apartment before 11:45. She could let this be private. She could let the story belong to Grant. Let him explain the absent bride. Let him manage the narrative. He was very good at managing narratives. He would call it cold feet. He would call it her instability. He would find a way to make himself the reasonable party. The patient man. The one who gave everything and was left standing at an altar. He had practice. Clara had not spoken. Clara had absorbed it privately. The thought moved through her and left. She was not going out the back door. She had known that from the moment she stood up from the vent. But she needed to sit with the choice one more time. She needed to feel the weight of the alternative so that what she was actually choosing felt real and deliberate and fully hers, because she had made too many choices that didn't feel fully hers. She was not going to make this one that way. She thought about the next hour. She would speak in front of 200 people. She would name what she had heard and what she knew. Grant would have his communications team working by afternoon. Warren would be on calls before she got back upstairs. The story would be contested. The story would always be contested when one party had significantly more resources than the other. But the story would exist, her version of it, spoken out loud, in a garden, in front of people who were there, who heard it from her mouth. He could not take that back. He could not transfer that to the Alderton Family Trust. She thought about Whitfield's studio. The clause in paragraph 9 was legally fragile. She knew that now. Her attorney, the one she had called 6 months ago, the one in her own phone contacts, the one Grant had never suggested, had told her 6 weeks ago, when Thomas first reached out through channels Grant didn't monitor, that the basis of the transfer would not survive scrutiny. The firm was hers. It had always been hers. He had simply borrowed it, briefly, under the impression that she would never notice. She thought about the drafting table, $60, slightly uneven, the matchbook under the short leg. She thought about the first client, a small renovation project in Cambridge. She had driven 2 hours each way for 4 consecutive Saturdays to measure the space because she didn't have money for a second trip if she missed something. She thought about the second client, the one who referred her to a third, the moment she understood that a reputation builds on itself, that each thing done well becomes the foundation for the next thing. 12 years. He had tried to take 12 years. He was not going to succeed. I was so stupid, she thought. And then, immediately, no, I wasn't stupid. I was trusting. I trusted the wrong person. That is not the same thing. She sat with that distinction. It mattered. She had not been foolish. She had been a person who loved someone and extended the good faith that love requires. She had been a person who wanted a partnership and accepted what was offered, because it came wrapped in all the forms she had been taught. Partnership looked like attention, resources, stability, someone who always had a plan. He had exploited her trust. That was on him. The wound was hers, but the fault was his. She stood up. She looked out the window one last time. Grant was at the altar, his gray morning suit perfect. His back to her from here, his posture arranged in that public ease. He did not know. He was standing there in complete confidence, about to receive something he believed he had already secured. He had done the legal work. He had managed the relationships. He had arranged the morning so that by the time Caroline walked down that aisle, the only remaining step was the ceremonial one. The public performance of something that was, in his mind, already done. He did not know she had heard him. He did not know Nora had made a choice. He did not know Thomas Beckett was sitting in the 6th row with 4 years of documents saved to 3 cloud accounts and an attorney already briefed. He did not know what he was about to see when he turned around. "I'm ready, Mom," she said. Petra appeared in the alcove entrance. She looked at Caroline's face for a moment. "You look like yourself," she said. "Finally, like yourself." Caroline smiled. For the first time all morning, she actually smiled. "Good," she said. "That's exactly right." The processional music floated up, something slow and classical. The string quartet had been playing for 3 minutes. Below, she could hear the rustling settle, the crowd finding its stillness, the way a room changes when it knows the thing it's been waiting for is about to begin. She appeared at the garden entrance on her mother's arm. 200 people rose to their feet. The sound of them rising, the collective rustle of fabric, the scrape of chair legs on brick, the small adjustments, was something she had imagined many times. In the imagining, it was always transcendent, tearful, and golden. The moment she had been moving toward. In reality, it was something more interesting than transcendent. She was completely calm. She looked at the faces as she passed. First row, right side. Petra was already there, having slipped around through a side path. Their eyes met. Petra gave her nothing. No nod, no signal, just presence, just, I'm here. Third row, Grant's mother, flown in from Scottsdale. She wore a silk dress in pale gold and an expression of composed approval. She had never called Caroline by her first name. She had not done it once in 4 years, always dear or darling, the kind of endearments that establish distance rather than close it. Fifth row, Grant's senior vice president, the one who had called her boutique firm charming at a dinner 18 months ago. She had smiled at that. She had explained it away as a generational thing, a business culture thing, a not worth addressing thing. She had a lot of practice explaining things away. Sixth row, left side, Thomas Beckett. He was watching her with something careful in his face, something that held both support and a specific kind of fear. The fear of someone who knows what's coming and understands the cost and believes the cost is worth it, but is afraid on her behalf anyway. She gave him the smallest nod. He exhaled. She kept walking. The garden smelled like roses and freshly cut grass, and the faint mineral coolness of the morning air. The sun was high enough now to be warm. The eucalyptus arrangements caught the light. It was, she noticed, a genuinely beautiful setting. He had excellent taste. She had always known that about him. She had just not understood what his taste was in service of. She reached the altar. Grant turned. His face did what it always did when he looked at her in public. That particular opening, the smile that started in his eyes and moved to his mouth in a way that read as spontaneous, but that she had watched him practice in mirrors when he thought no one was watching the curated warmth. She used to love that expression. She used to feel, every time it landed on her, that she was the luckiest woman in any room. She took her place opposite him. He reached for her hands. She gave them to him. His hands were warm. They were always warm. She used to love that too. Somewhere along the way, she thought, I became invisible. Not to everyone, to herself. She had made herself invisible to herself by believing his version of her was the true one, by letting his assessment replace her own, by explaining away her instincts until they went quiet. Father Brennan began. He was 67 years old and had performed hundreds of ceremonies. He stood at the altar with his vestments and his practiced solemnity and began the words he had spoken so many times they had become breath. We are gathered here today in the presence of family and friends. Grant's hands were warm around hers. His thumbs moved slightly, a small proprietary gesture. She watched his face. He was looking at her with absolute confidence. He had won. In his mind, he had already won. The legal work was done. The ceremony was the last formality. She was standing here holding his hands, about to say the words that completed the transaction. That was what this was to him, a transaction. Caroline looked at him, and she felt with absolute clarity that she knew exactly what she was about to do. Father Brennan reached the rings. Grant's best man stepped forward, produced the ring box. Grant took Caroline's ring, the same one she had worn for 14 months, the one she had thanked him for, the one she had shown her friends, with that complicated mix of joy and something she could never quite name, and slid it onto her finger, carefully, slowly, making it a moment. She looked at her own hand receiving it. She thought of the kitchen table, the apple, Paragraph 9. The Tuesday afternoon that cost her everything she had built. She thought of Thomas, keeping those files for 4 years. Not as leverage, not with any expectation, simply because they were hers and he thought someday she might want them back. She thought, the people who actually love you don't ask you to disappear. Father Brennan looked up from his text. He looked at the congregation. He said the words, "If anyone here knows of any reason why these two should not be joined in marriage." Grant did not look around. Why would he? This was a formality. This was ritual. This was the part that no one ever answered. Speak now, or forever hold your peace. The garden was perfectly silent. The string quartet had stopped. A bird somewhere in the trees behind the gazebo. The distant clink of a glass from the cocktail station 30 feet to the left. Caroline took a breath. She spoke. She did not shout. She did not cry. She did not perform. She simply spoke, in her own voice, clearly, to the 200 people who had gathered here to witness something. "I do," she said. Grant's face relaxed. Half a second, the beginning of relief. "Have a reason." The garden went still in a way that was different from the stillness before. This stillness had texture. It had weight. It was the stillness of 200 people simultaneously stopping what they were doing with every part of themselves. Grant looked at her. His face did something she had never seen it do. It went blank. Not angry, not guilty, not the practiced warmth or the curated ease, blank. Like a screen that has lost its signal. Like a man who is so accustomed to controlling outcomes that the experience of not controlling one has temporarily removed his ability to respond. Caroline turned slightly. Not away from him, just enough to include the congregation. "I heard you this morning," she said. "Through the vent in the wall, you and your father." A sound moved through the crowd, wordless, the sound of comprehension beginning. "I know about Sylvia," she said. "I know what this marriage was supposed to be and what it wasn't. I know about the clause in the agreement I signed. I know about my firm." She paused. She looked at Grant. "I want everyone here to know, not only because I want to humiliate you." A pause. The garden waited. "Well, not only because of that." 3 people in the congregation laughed. Distinct, separate laughs from 3 different corners. Startled and genuine, then a broader ripple. It helped. She had not planned that line, but it helped. She spoke for 6 minutes. She told a story, her story, with the same precision she had always brought to her work. The work he had tried to quietly absorb into his empire. She was not loud. She did not use the language of accusation. She used the language of fact. The kind of language that doesn't require embellishment because the facts themselves are sufficient. She talked about the clause in paragraph 9. She described the document. She named the holding company. She named the date. She said, 3 months ago, while we were in Napa, while I was walking through vineyards, thinking this is what partnership feels like, he was registering my firm to his family trust." She talked about Sylvia Crane, not with cruelty, with clarity. "Grant has a relationship that predates our engagement by 2 years, the woman who drafted our prenuptial agreement, the woman who ensured I could not contest the settlement floor." She talked about Thomas Becket. She turned slightly, gestured toward the 6th row on the left. "This man," she said, "kept the original registration documents for my company for 4 years. He kept them because he knew they were mine. He never expected anything in return. He never used them. He simply kept them. Because he thought someday I might want them back." A pause. "That is what it looks like when someone actually respects you." Grant made a sound, very controlled. "Caroline, this isn't the place." She turned back to him. "This is exactly the place," she said. "You chose this hotel. You chose the guest list. You arranged every element of this ceremony so that it reflected well on you. This is your stage, Grant. I'm just using it." From the front row on Grant's side, Warren Alderton began to rise. He got halfway out of his chair. From the front row on Caroline's side, Diane Whitfield stood up. She was 64 years old, and she had been divorced twice and rebuilt herself twice, and she wore a pale blue dress and a look on her face that was perfectly composed and entirely unmovable. "Sit down," she said. Warren Alderton sat down. This surprised everyone in the garden, including, Caroline noticed, Diane herself, though she hid it well. Caroline continued, "I want to be clear," she said. "This isn't about revenge. I don't want his money. I don't want his hotel. I don't want anything that belongs to him." She paused. "I want my firm back. I want my name back. I want the 4 years back. But since I can't have those, I'll take what I can actually recover." She looked at Grant. "Advertiser." He was standing at the altar with his hands at his sides and his face completely still. All his life he had managed narratives. He had controlled rooms. He had ensured that every story ended the way he intended. He was very good at this. He would recover from today. She was not naive. He had resources and relationships and a communications team and a great deal of practice. But he could not manage this moment. This moment was already in the world. It was in the memory of 200 people. It was in the recordings on the phones that had been discreetly raised throughout her speech. She had counted at least 14. It was in the air of this garden. He could not transfer this moment to the Alderton Family Trust. It was hers. Permanently and completely. Everyone finally sees who he really is, she thought. She looked at Father Brennan. He had gone a remarkable shade of pale. He was holding his book with both hands, and his mouth had opened and closed twice without producing sound. She felt briefly sorry for him. He had not signed up for this. "Thank you," she said. "I'm sorry for the disruption. I appreciate you being here." He managed a nod. She turned back to the congregation. "Thank you all for coming," she said. "Please enjoy the reception. I did pay for half of it." The laugh this time was broader, warmer. She reached for the ring. She held it for a moment. She looked at it. The 3 carats, the platinum band, the thing she had worn for 14 months and thanked him for and shown her friends and worn to bed at night with the specific warmth of believing she was loved. She placed it on the velvet ring pillow in the best man's hand. Gently, the way you put something down when you know it's the last time you'll touch it. She picked up her cathedral train. She turned. She walked back down the aisle, not on anyone's arm, just herself, straight-backed, unhurried, her grandmother's combs still in her hair, her bouquet in her hand, the dress with its 32 buttons still perfectly done. The string quartet, after a moment of very intense eye contact among its 4 members, began to play. She walked through the garden entrance. She kept walking. The ornamental pond was at the end of a stone path on the east side of the hotel garden. She found it almost by accident. She simply walked, followed the path away from the voices, away from the movement, away from the particular noise of 200 people, simultaneously processing what they had just witnessed. The path curved behind a hedge of boxwood, and there it was. A small rectangular pond. Still water lilies near one edge, a stone bench beside it, a redbud tree casting a loose pattern of shadow across the brick. She sat on the bench. The bouquet went beside her. She looked at the water. It was 11:47 in the morning, 57 degrees, with the promise of warmth. The sky was the specific blue of late spring, not summer blue yet, still something softer. A pair of sparrows moved through the redbud tree above her. She heard footsteps. Petra. She sat beside her without a word. Then Diane. She sat on the other side and tucked her hand into Caroline's arm. Thomas appeared on the path. He stopped at a respectful distance. Diane looked at him and gestured with her chin, "Just come and sit down," and he came and sat on the grass near the bench, because there was no more room on the bench itself. Nora appeared last. She carried a glass of ice water. She set it beside Caroline on the bench arm without asking. Then she stood for a moment. Then she sat on the stone edging of the pond. The five of them stayed there for a while. The noise from the main garden, voices, movement, the aggressive electronic buzz of phones being used urgently reached them in fragments, muffled, like weather from a distance. Grant's communications team was already working. She knew that. Warren was on calls. The story was being managed from multiple angles. A version of this morning was being shaped right now that would appear in certain circles by afternoon. She let it happen. She was looking at the water. A water lily moved slightly in a current she couldn't see. She thought about Monday. She would call her attorney first thing. The conversation they had been building toward for 6 weeks, the one that would begin the formal process of recovering what was hers, would begin in earnest. There would be filings. There would be negotiations. There would almost certainly be a period, possibly a long one, during which Grant's team tried to make the process expensive and exhausting. She was not afraid of expensive and exhausting. She had built something from a $60 drafting table. She knew what effort looked like. She reached up. She took out her grandmother's combs. Carefully, both of them, she held them in her palm. 2 small gold pieces set with seed pearls, warm from being in her hair all morning. Her grandmother, in 1951. Her mother, at her second wedding, the one that lasted. These are mine, she thought. These have always been mine. She put them in the small bag Petra was holding. She felt her hair fall loose, the weight of it dropping to her shoulders, the physical relief of it. Like setting something down you've been carrying without realizing how heavy it was. Good, she thought. Good, Diane said. I knew. Caroline looked at her. I want you to know that. I knew something was wrong. I didn't know the specifics, but I knew something in the structure of it wasn't right. She paused. I didn't say anything because I've been wrong before. About men, about relationships. I didn't want to take him from you if I was wrong. Were you wrong? Not even slightly. Caroline took her mother's hand. It was warm. It was exactly the right temperature. For the record, Petra said, I am never biting my tongue again in my entire life. Please don't, Caroline said. I mean it, not for anyone, not for any reason. That's done. Good, Caroline said. Thomas cleared his throat. The documents are already with your attorney. She'll have everything she needs by this afternoon. Caroline nodded. Thank you. The firm is yours, he said. We're going to get it back. She looked at him. You said, we? He shrugged, careful. If you want, I have a proposal, a business one. You can read it whenever you're ready. No pressure, no deadline. She considered this. Thomas Beckett. The person Grant had told her was not the right influence. The person she had walked away from without a real explanation, without the courtesy of honesty, because she was managing someone else's preferences. He had kept her files for 4 years. He had not called in the favor. He had not leveraged it. He had not shown up at her door and said, look what I have. He had simply kept the files because they were hers and because he thought someday she might want them back. Monday, she said. Send it Monday, and I'll read it Monday. He nodded. Nora stood. She collected the empty glass. She was about to do what she always did. Slip away quietly, manage the next detail, make herself useful and invisible. Caroline spoke before she could move. What will you do now? She asked. Nora looked at her. I'll be released by end of business, that's certain. I have an office, Caroline said. I'm getting it back, if you need work. I mean that. I don't say things I don't mean." Nora was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to hold something real. "I'll think about it," she said, but she didn't leave. She sat back down on the stone edging of the pond. She looked at the water. The five of them sat in the late morning sun. The redbud tree moved above them. The sparrows returned. From somewhere in the main hotel, a door opened and music drifted out. Something from the reception that was apparently going ahead without a wedding to accompany it, because Caroline had told them to, and because the caterers had been paid, and because 200 people were still wearing their good clothes and needed somewhere to be. She looked at the pond. She thought about going home, her apartment, the one she had kept, the one that was entirely, unambiguously hers. Her name on the lease, her furniture, her drafting table, the new one, not the estate sale one, but with the same energy, her books, her measuring tools, hanging on the wall in the order she had always hung them. She was going to go home. She was going to change out of this dress. She was going to make coffee and let it go slightly cold and stand at her drafting table and open her laptop and look at the original Whitfield Studio files from 12 years ago. And then she was going to start, not start over. She was not starting over. She was starting forward, from here. From this exact moment. From the woman sitting on a stone bench in a garden with her hair loose and her grandmother's combs in her bag, and 4 people beside her who had chosen her side when sides had to be chosen. She looked at the sky. The hardest part, she thought, is admitting I knew all along. And then, but I know now, and knowing now is enough. Knowing now is what I have to work with. That was not a small thing. That was everything. 6 weeks later, Chicago, a symposium on sustainable structural design. A field she had been following for 2 years, watching from the edges, collecting information, building toward something she hadn't had the space to pursue while she was managing someone else's preferences. She was presenting. She arrived at the conference hotel the evening before. She checked in under her own name. She had coffee alone in the hotel restaurant and read through her presentation notes and called Petra to talk about nothing important for 40 minutes. She slept well. In the morning, she ordered room service. She ate at the desk while going through her slides. She showered and dressed and put on the specific earring she always wore when she needed to feel precise. Small gold drops, nothing elaborate. She did not put on her grandmother's combs. The combs were on her dresser at home. They were waiting for the right occasion. She walked to the conference hall. The room was filling. Designers, architects, engineers, academics, a few journalists. 200 people, approximately. She noticed the number without particular feeling. 200 people had a different weight to it now. Not a threatening weight, just a weight. She set up her materials. She checked the slide display twice. She spoke briefly with the conference coordinator, a woman named Ruth who had warm eyes and a very efficient manner. She drank half a glass of water. Then she went to the podium. The room settled. She looked at the faces. People who worked in her field. People who had spent years developing expertise she respected. People who didn't know anything about the Alderton Grand Hotel garden on a late spring morning 6 weeks ago, and who were here simply because they cared about the same things she cared about. It was a relief, actually, to be in a room where she was simply her work, where what she had built and what she knew was the entire point. She began. 12 years ago, she said, I built a studio from a drafting table. I bought it in a estate sale, and 2 clients who believed in me before I had a track record. In the years since, I got a little lost. She paused. Recently, I found my way back. The room was quiet, the particular quiet of people listening. What I learned in getting lost. And what I want to share with you today is something I think applies to more than structural design. She looked at the room. If you build something that is genuinely yours, that comes from your specific intelligence and taste and stubbornness, no one can take it. Not permanently, not completely. It always finds its way back to you, a pause. Because it was never just the thing. It was never just the studio, or the drawings, or the firm. It was you. She leaned slightly forward. It was always you. The room was silent for one more second. Then someone started to clap. Then someone else. Then the whole room. She stood at the podium and let it happen, not with the performed grace she had spent 4 years perfecting. The careful, managed composure of a woman managing someone else's impression of her. Just herself, standing at a podium in Chicago, with her own notes in front of her, and her own name on the program, and her own voice still in the air. Whitfield Studios' legal recovery had begun 2 weeks prior. Her attorney was confident. The clause was not going to hold. Thomas's documents were solid. The process would take time. These things always took time. But the direction was clear. She had read Thomas's proposal on a Monday morning, as promised. It was good, better than good. The kind of proposal that comes from someone who has been thinking seriously about a problem for a long time and has finally been given permission to say what they know. She had called him back the same afternoon. "When can you start?" she asked. "I've been ready for 4 years," he said. She had laughed, again, that real laugh that filled the room. She was noticing how often it came back. The laugh she had explained away, muffled, managed for 4 years. It kept returning. Louder than before, less apologetic. Nora had called on a Wednesday. "I've thought about it," she said. "And? The offer still stands?" "The offer still stands." "Then yes." Diane called every Sunday. She had always called every Sunday. That had not changed. What changed was the quality of the calls, the ease in them, the absence of the particular tension that comes when two people who love each other are both carefully not saying something. They said everything now. Petra had kept her word. She was saying everything to everyone, at all times. It was occasionally a lot. It was mostly wonderful. The applause in the conference room settled. Caroline looked at her notes. She had 40 minutes. She had enough material for 2 hours. She had, she realized, been building toward this presentation in the back of her mind for years. Collecting ideas, noticing patterns, developing a perspective that was genuinely hers, shaped by her specific experience and knowledge. She had simply not had the room for it. She had been so occupied managing the space she was allowed to take up that she hadn't noticed how much she had been accumulating. She had a lot to say. "Let's start with the question of load-bearing," she said. "And I mean that in both the structural and the personal sense." A small laugh from the audience, alert, engaged. She smiled. She was, she thought, exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because fate had arranged it, not because some larger plan had been steering her toward this room and this podium, but because she had made a choice in a hotel corridor at 11:23 in the morning not to go out the back door, because she had walked down an aisle instead and stood at an altar and said what was true, because she had sat by a pond afterward and let herself grieve and then let herself think about Monday. Because she had called her attorney and read a proposal and made an offer and answered the phone. Because she had, one small decision at a time, chosen herself. The prison door had been unlocked the whole time, she thought. I just had to stop explaining away the exit. She looked at the room, 200 people looking back at her. She took a breath. She began.
She walked back down that aisle alone. No one on her arm. No music chosen for the occasion. Just herself. straight-backed, unhurried. And that image that single image of a woman walking away from a beautiful lie, is the heart of everything this story was trying to say. So let's talk about what it actually means. The first thing this story teaches us is something uncomfortable. Manipulation rarely looks like manipulation. It doesn't arrive wearing a warning label. It doesn't announce itself. It comes dressed as love, as protection, as thoughtfulness, a rebooked flight, a corrected sentence at a dinner party, a document slid across a kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon, each one small, each one explainable, each one alone meaning nothing. But together they are a cage. And the most important thing to understand is this. The cage was not built in a day. It was built over 4 years. One small surrender at a time, each surrender feeling in the moment like maturity, like compromise, like love. That is how it works. Not dramatically, quietly, until you look up and you no longer recognize your own life. The second thing this story teaches us is about the moment of knowing. There is a moment, and most of us have had it in some form, when the body understands something the mind hasn't caught up to yet. A voice through a vent, a text message left unreturned, a look across a room that doesn't quite add up. The body knows first, and what we do with that knowing, that is the whole question. Caroline's instinct for 4 years was to explain it away, to assume she was overreacting, to give the benefit of the doubt, to protect the version of the relationship she wanted to be living in. She was not foolish for doing this. She was human. We all do this. We all protect the story we want to be true for as long as we can. But there comes a moment when protecting the story costs you yourself. And that is when the choice arrives. The third thing, and this is the most important one, she did not go out the back door. She could have. The exit was 30 seconds away. She knew where it was. She could have made this private, absorbed it quietly, let the story belong to him. She chose differently. Not because she needed revenge. She said that clearly at the altar, in front of everyone. This wasn't revenge. It was refusal. Refusal to let someone else write the ending of her story. Refusal to make herself small one more time. Refusal to pretend she hadn't heard what she heard and known what she knew. And that refusal, calm, unhurried, spoken in her own voice at a microphone she didn't plan to use. That was the most powerful thing she ever did, not because it destroyed him, but because it returned her to herself. The real lesson of this story is not about weddings. It is not about billionaires. It is not even about betrayal. It is about this. The moment you stop explaining away what you know, that is the moment you begin to come back to yourself. It doesn't require an altar. It doesn't require an audience. It doesn't require a dramatic speech in front of 200 people. It just requires one choice: to trust what you know, to stop negotiating with the truth that has already arrived, to pick up the cathedral train of whatever life you're carrying right now and walk. Wherever you are today, whatever room you are in, whatever decision is sitting in front of you, we hope this story gave you something to take with you. Not advice, not instructions, just the reminder that the door has been unlocked the whole time. You simply have to choose to walk through it. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. If this story stayed with you, share it. Pass it to someone who needs it. Leave a comment and tell us what it meant to you. Your words matter more than you know. They tell us that what we are building here is reaching someone. Subscribe if you haven't already. We will be here next week with another story. Until then, Take care of yourself. You deserve that. This content was researched, developed, and manually crafted by our team with the sole intention of bringing meaning, healing, and genuine life lessons to every person who listens. Every word was chosen with care. Every story was built to matter. We do not generate and forget. We create and we mean it. Thank you for being part of this community.